She was not a demon. They made her one because she was the only soul in all of creation who looked the Archons directly in the eye and said no. And when they realized they could not control her, could not recycle her, could not break her, they did something far more dangerous than destroying her. They rewrote her. They buried her name inside a curse and handed it to every civilization that came after so that no one would ever dare to follow her path. Before there was a church, before there was a Bible, before there was a single priest standing before a congregation telling you who God is and what God wants, there was a story. A story so old it predates written language. A story carried in the mouths of the first people who ever looked up at the stars and asked the question that every human being has asked since the beginning of time. Why does this world feel wrong? And inside that question, hidden like a jewel wrapped in mud, was a name. A name that would eventually be stripped of everything it once meant, twisted beyond recognition, and handed back to humanity as a warning, as a curse, as a symbol of everything a woman must never be and everything a soul must never dare to become. Their name is Lilith, and what you are about to hear is not the story you were given. It is not the cautionary tale of a rebellious woman who chose demons over God. It is not the mythology of a night creature who steals children in the dark. What you are about to hear is the original story, the one that existed before the rewriting, the one the Gnostics preserve in fragments and whispers, the one that answers with terrifying clarity why this name specifically had to be destroyed. Because Lilith was not a demon. She was a mirror, and what she reflected was so dangerous to the system built around her that the architects of that system spent thousands of years making sure you would never look directly into it. To understand what Lilith truly represents, you have to understand what the world looked like before the version of reality you were handed at birth. The Gnostics, those ancient seekers of hidden knowledge whose texts were buried in the desert sands of Nag Hammadi in Egypt for over 1,600 years, taught something that the dominant religious institutions of the world have always found deeply threatening. They taught that the world you see around you, the world of suffering and cycles and endless forgetting, was not created by the true divine source. It was created by something else, something lesser, something that mistook itself for God. They called this being the demiurge, a blind architect, a false creator who shaped matter into what the Gnostics described as a prison, an elaborate and beautiful cage designed to keep the divine sparks of humanity locked inside cycles of birth, suffering, forgetting, death, and rebirth. And serving this false creator were beings the Gnostics called the Archons, cosmic administrators of the prison, forces that governed perception, shaped belief, and harvested the energy of souls who never knew they were trapped. This is the world Lilith was born into, and this is the world she refused. The oldest surviving written reference to Lilith appears in ancient Sumerian texts, some of the earliest written records in all of human history, where she is described as a wild wind spirit, untamable, connected to the liminal spaces between worlds, the edges where the known dissolves into the unknown. She was not evil in these texts. She was simply free. And in a system built on control, freedom is the most dangerous thing that can exist. By the time the ancient Babylonian and Assyrian traditions had developed their cosmologies, Lilith had already begun her transformation in the cultural record. She was becoming associated with the night, with the wilderness, with the places outside the city walls where civilization's rules no longer applied. But even here, even in these early transformations, there is something important hidden beneath the surface. The places Lilith inhabits are not evil places. They're simply places beyond the reach of the system. The wilderness is beyond the reach of the king. The night is beyond the reach of the overseer. The edges are beyond the reach of the law, and Lilith lived in all of them. It is in the Jewish mystical tradition, specifically in a medieval text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, that the story most modern people know is first written down in the form that would come to define Lilith for centuries. In this text, Lilith is described as the first wife of Adam, created from the same earth at the same time, equal in nature and origin. And when Adam attempts to assert dominance over her, when he insists she must lie beneath him, Lilith refuses. She speaks the unspeakable name of God, rises into the air, and leaves. She leaves. That is the act for which she is punished. Not violence, not deception, not darkness. She simply refuses to accept a position of submission that was never her nature, and she leaves. What happens next in the traditional telling is where the rewriting begins in earnest. According to the text, God sends 3 angels to bring her back. She refuses to return, and in refusing, she is cursed. She is told that her children will die. She is transformed in the cultural imagination from a free soul into a demon who murders infants, who seduces men in their sleep, who brings disease and madness and chaos wherever she goes. But look at what actually happened. Look at the structure of the story itself. A being was created equal, was told she was not equal, refused to accept that lie, and was then punished for the refusal. And the punishment was not simply exile. The punishment was transformation. The punishment was the systematic destruction of her meaning. This is the archonic pattern the Gnostics warned about. It does not destroy what it fears. It rewrites it. It takes the thing that threatens the system and inverts it, turns it inside out, coats it in darkness until the original shape is unrecognizable. And then it hands the distorted version back to the people as a warning. Look at what happens to those who refuse. Look at what happens to those who say no. The Gnostics understood this pattern intimately because they had watched it happen to everything sacred. They had watched the divine feminine, which they understood as a living cosmic force, the embodiment of wisdom itself, be systematically stripped of her power and rewritten as either a passive vessel or an active danger. In their cosmology, the divine feminine was not a supporting character. She was fundamental to the nature of reality itself. In Gnostic thought, the true divine source is not a singular masculine authority sitting on a throne. The true source is a vast, luminous fullness called the pleroma, a realm of pure light and consciousness from which all genuine reality emanates. And within the pleroma, the divine expresses itself in pairs of opposites that exist in perfect balance, masculine and feminine, light and its reflection, knowing and being known. The figure the Gnostics called Sophia, whose name means wisdom, was one of these divine emanations. She was the embodiment of the divine feminine principle within the pleroma itself. And it was her act of creation, her reaching beyond the fullness without her counterpart, that according to the Gnostic myth resulted in the birth of the demiurge and the construction of the material prison. This is not a story of feminine failure. Despite how it has sometimes been interpreted, this is a story of what happens when the divine feminine is separated from her full nature, when the wholeness of the feminine principle is split and isolated. The result is a world out of balance, a world governed by the masculine principle alone, which in the absence of its counterpart becomes not wisdom but control, not guidance but domination. Lilith, in the framework of the Gnostic understanding, is not a demon and is not simply a rebellious woman. She is the divine feminine principle in its most original, uncompromising, undiluted form. She is what the feminine looks like before the system gets its hands on it, before it is told to be quiet, before it is told to submit, before it is told that its power is actually danger and its freedom is actually sin. She is Sophia before the fall. She is the pleroma before the fracture. She is the divine spark in its purest expression, the part of creation that looks at the cage and says with absolute clarity, "This was not built by the true God. I know the difference, and I will not pretend otherwise." This is why she had to be destroyed, not because she was dangerous in the way a weapon is dangerous, but because she was dangerous in the way a mirror is dangerous when it shows you something true. Lilith, in her original form, showed every soul that looked at her story the most threatening truth the archonic system had to hide. That you were not created to serve the prison. That your original nature is not submission. That the voice inside you that has always known something was wrong about this world is not madness or sin or rebellion. It is memory. It is the divine spark remembering what it was before it forgot. The transformation of Lilith from free soul to demon did not happen all at once. It was a process that unfolded across centuries and across cultures, and it followed a pattern that, once you see it, you will recognize everywhere. The first step was isolation. Lilith was removed from the garden, from community, from the structure of the sacred narrative. She was placed outside, and anything placed outside the boundary of the acceptable becomes, by definition, suspect. The second step was association. Lilith was associated with the night, with the wilderness, with sexuality outside of sanctioned bounds, with death, with chaos. Each of these associations carried its own cultural weight, its own emotional charge, and by accumulating them around her name, her original meaning was gradually buried beneath layers of fear response. The third step was projection. Every quality that the dominant system needed to suppress in order to maintain control was projected onto Lilith. The longing for freedom became dangerous rebellion. The refusal to submit became murderous rage. The connection to the wild, uncontrolled aspects of nature became a threat to children, to families, to civilization itself. Everything the system feared about its own instability was given her face. And the fourth step, the most insidious of all, was repetition. The rewritten story was told so many times, across so many generations, in so many cultural contexts, that the original version became almost impossible to find. By the time most people encountered the name Lilith, they encountered it already wrapped in centuries of accumulated darkness, already preloaded with the emotional response the rewriters intended. This is what the Gnostics called the veil, not a metaphysical barrier between worlds, but a perceptual distortion woven so deeply into the fabric of transmitted knowledge that most people never realized it was there. You did not need to be shown the truth of Lilith and then have it taken away. You simply needed to never be shown it in the first place. You needed to receive only the rewritten version, to absorb it in childhood, before your capacity for critical inquiry had fully developed, to have it reinforced by every authority figure and cultural institution around you, until the rewritten version felt not like a story you had been told, but like a fact you had always known. This is how the Archonic system maintains itself across time, not through direct force, but through the control of transmitted meaning, not through locking the doors, but through making the prisoners believe the doors were always walls. But here is what the system could never fully eliminate. The original frequency of what Lilith represents could be buried, distorted, and cursed. But it could not be destroyed, because it was not a story. It was a pattern woven into the structure of consciousness itself. And patterns that deep do not disappear simply because someone rewrites the language used to describe them. You have felt this pattern. Every human being who has ever looked at the world they were handed and felt that something essential was missing, that something fundamental had been taken or hidden or inverted, has touched the frequency Lilith represents. Every soul who has ever stood at the edge of the acceptable and felt the pull of what lies beyond it has heard her signal. Every person who has ever been told that their refusal to comply is the same as their destruction, that their freedom is the same as their danger, that their seeing is the same as their sin, has lived inside the story that was written about her. The Gnostic path was never about rejecting the material world in despair. It was about seeing through it with enough clarity to stop being governed by its illusions. And part of that seeing is the recovery of meaning, the recovery of what was buried in the rewriting, the return of the signal beneath the noise. Lilith, restored to her original frequency, is not a demon to be feared. She is a teacher. She is the part of yourself that has always known the difference between the false light and the true one. The part that looks at the systems built around you and asks, with clear eyes, who benefits from my compliance with this? The part that remembers, however faintly, that your original nature was not submission and your original purpose was not to fuel someone else's dominion. The Archons do not fear your darkness. They built the concept of your darkness as a cage. What they fear is your clarity, your willingness to look at the rewritten story and see the original beneath it, your refusal to accept the inverted version of your own nature as a permanent truth. Lilith said no, and in saying no, she did not become a demon. She became a door that has been standing open for thousands of years, waiting for the souls brave enough to walk through it. Not into chaos, not into darkness, but into the part of themselves that has never been successfully imprisoned. The part that carries the original frequency of what they were before the system got its hands on them. That frequency is still transmitting. It has always been transmitting. You just had to learn the name they gave it to recognize that you have been hearing it all along. What was done to Lilith was not unique to her. It was a template, a blueprint for the silencing of every truth too dangerous to be left intact. Her story is a map of the method, and now that you have seen the method, you will begin to see it everywhere. In every narrative handed to you, without question. In every name that carries an ancient curse. In every part of yourself you are taught to fear. The rewriting never stops, but neither does the original signal. If this reached something in you that has no name yet, stay with that feeling. That wordless recognition is not confusion. It is the beginning of remembering. Subscribe to Gnostic Inner so you are there when the next layer is uncovered. Leave a comment below with the one word that came to your mind when you first heard her name. And if someone in your life has been carrying a story written about them by someone else, share this with them, because the truth was never buried deep enough to stay buried forever.